Okay, 7th grade, for our activator today, we're going to shift our focus away from just fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, and we're really going to focus in on poetry. We have some review terms that you may remember from 6th grade or 5th grade. Personification, simile, and metaphor match the definition. Part 2, identify each one as personification, metaphor, and simile. And Part 3, after your short answer question, Part 3, label your annotations. I'm going to give 3 minutes on the timer for your activator. Looking over it, working carefully, and go. That is time. So again, you might have remembered some of these terms, you might not. Personification is A, giving human-like things to something that is not human. We'll see some examples here in a second. A simile is comparing two unlike things with, like, or as. So C was the correct answer for simile. And a metaphor is comparing two unlike things without using the words like or as. So with that difference between simile and metaphor, the way I remember that, the S and the L in simile, you compare two things using like or as with the S. And a metaphor does not use those two words. Now let's come down here and look over our examples. My dog is a lion. I noticed that dog was being compared to a lion without using like or as. That is an example of a metaphor. The trees danced in the wind. The trees danced. Giving human-like qualities, trees can't really dance. That's an example of personification. The sun was like a golden ball, comparing the sun to a ball. Using this word like, this is a simile. My mother is a monster when you wake her up at night. Some of you might have mamas like that. Comparing mother to a monster without using like or as, that is a metaphor. The birds sang like a choir, comparing birds to a choir, and I see that word like. So that is a simile. The dark clouds were like a blanket across the sky, comparing clouds to a blanket with the word like. This, again, is a simile. As you came down here, you could have talked about how a metaphor is different from a simile because a simile uses the words like or as. A metaphor does not. And this one was really easy. Metaphor, simile, personification, repetition. The figurative language we're really going to see in our poem today is personification. So I really want you to be thinking about that one, giving human-like qualities, circle that one, for something that is not human. So today's objective is that you're going to be able to use our annotations to analyze a poem, and that you're going to be able to score proficient on the sort of end of lesson quiz on the questions over a poem we're going to be reading today. Before we dive into our poem, I'm going to do a very quick reteach over the next 2 minutes from the most missed question from Monday's quiz. So please flip to this page in your packet. You guys are going to get questions that are asking you the meaning of words in the context of a passage. You had this passage about the horse, the short story about the man and his daughter and their horse on Monday, and you got this question. What is the meaning of the word tearing as it is used in paragraph 1 of the passage? Some of you, about a bunch of you, about 20%, said tearing meant ripping. The other 20% said that tearing meant pulling. You probably thought is when you tear something, you pull it, or when you tear it, you rip it. When you get to a question like this, you need to go back into the passage and find the word. I'm reading. I found it right here. Circle it. Tearing. Take a look. Your horse put his head between his knees again, took off bucking, kicking higher and higher until he finally dropped you and went tearing off to the other end of the ring. So I noticed that they said that the horse went tearing off to the other end of the ring. It doesn't make sense for it to say ripping off to the end of the ring. Pulling off to the other end of the ring doesn't make as much sense. It seems like they're saying the horse was speeding. If you get this one right, your evidence should be really easy. What part of the sentence did we see tearing coming up in where it said to the other end of the ring? That phrase clued us in that tearing in this sentence meant speeding and not ripping or pulling. So just a quick reminder that when you get to these context clues questions, look for the word back up in the passage. Find it, read it, plug in your answer choices, choose the one that makes the most sense. Then choose the evidence that supports that around the word. That's just a quick reteach. At this time, go ahead and take out your poem and take out your text-dependent questions. Some of your questions today are going to be very short. I'm going to model reading through this poem for the first time. Whenever you're reading through a poem, you need to be looking for 2 key things. You need to be looking for repeating words and phrases, and you need to be looking for any sort of personification. Any sort of figurative language. What that means is personification, metaphor, or simile. Usually, poems will have a deeper meaning. It's like a puzzle. We've got to figure out what the deeper meaning is the first time you read through, or at least the second time. So on 10 Ready, if you get a poem, you need to be thinking, what is this poet literally talking about? But then also, what is the deeper meaning here? Take out your copy of your TDQs. I'm going to answer number 1. What is the title of the text? I noticed that the title of this poem is called This World. So I know that this poem is going to be talking something about the world we live in. We know it's a poem, so I'm going to put P for poetry. I'm also going to label that at the top of my text, get into that habit. Question 3 says, what does the poet say she wants to write a poem about? What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this question so I'm ready to answer it. The poet says she wants to write a poem about. I'm going to pause there. All right, so as I start to read through, again, I'm looking for any repeating words. I'm also looking for any examples of figurative language. But I also want to just see, what is this poet talking about? I. We know it is first person point of view. Label that. So somebody here is speaking. I would like to write a poem about the world that has in it nothing fancy, but it seems impossible. Pause there. Already we know that the poet wants to write a poem about the world and just the simple things in the world. She wants to write a poem about the things in the world that are simple and not fancy. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say, the poet says she wants to write a poem about the simple things in the world, not the fancy things. Take 15 seconds to make sure you have that. So again, I just read the first 5 lines of the poem, and already I have an idea of what this poet is talking about. First person point of view, she's sort of narrating her thoughts. She wants to write a poem about the world and just the simple things in the world, not the fancy things. Let's see what she means, because she goes on to say, but it seems impossible. Whatever the subject, the morning sun glimmers it. The tulip, I'm going to circle every image in here, and I'm going to label it with an I. The tulip feels the heat and flaps its petals open and becomes a star. Here's another image. The ants, here's an image, bore into the peony bud. Peony bud just means the part of the flower. And there is a dark pinprick well of sweetness. As for the stones, another image, on the beach, forget it. Each one could be set in gold. So far she's listed some simple things. A flower, ants, stones. But she says for each of these things aren't simple. There's something beautiful about them. Let's keep going. Each one could be set in gold. Could be set in gold. She's talking about how beautiful each of these simple things are. So I tried with my eyes shut. But of course, the birds, another image, label it with I, were singing. And the aspen trees were shaking the sweetest music out of their leaves. I. And that was followed by, guess what? A momentous and beautiful, underline beautiful, silence, as comes to all of us in little earfuls, if we're not too hurried to hear it. As for spiders, another image, how the dew hangs in their webs, even if they say nothing, or seem to say nothing. So fancy is the world, who knows, maybe they sing. So fancy is the world, who knows, maybe the stars sing too, and the ants, and the peonies, and the warm stones. I'm going to underline some repetition here that I see. Say nothing, say nothing. I'm going to label that R, R. I also saw, so fancy is the world, so fancy is the world. Label that R, repetition, repeating words. Who knows, maybe the stars, another image, sing too, and the ants and the peonies and the warm stones. So happy to be where they are, on the beach, instead of being locked up in gold. Interesting. So I'm going to come over here to my gist statement, because I need to think, like, what is this poem literally about? What is the poet talking? So I'm going to say, this poem, well, I noticed that the poet was talking about a lot of things in nature, stones, birds, trees, spiders. She wanted to write a poem about how things in the world are just simple and not fancy, but for each of these, she says how there's something beautiful or something amazing about each of these simple things in nature. So I'm going to say this poem is mainly about the simple things in the world that are truly beautiful, and I'm going to use her word, and fancy. Notice how my gist statement here, I'm going to label this gist. Notice how my gist statement here ties into the title of the poem. So I've read through the poem. I've identified some repetition. We'll get to our figurative language in a second. I've done my gist statement. I have a good idea of what this poem is actually about. Now, let's come over to some of our text-dependent questions. I want you to highlight number 6, because this one was actually out of order. It says, does the poet say that writing a poem about just the simple things in life, did she say this is impossible or possible? Well, I noticed back here in line 3, she said this seems impossible. So I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to say she said it's impossible. All right. The last thing that I'm going to model for you before I release you to finish these all by yourself is how you identify figurative language. So if I'm the reader and you get a poem on 10 Ready and you're looking for personification, simile, or metaphor, I do not remember seeing any examples of metaphor or simile. I don't remember seeing any like comparing two things with like or as. I don't see the word like. I don't see comparing two things, but I do see some examples of personification. Let's take a look at line 6. It says, the tulip feels the heat and flaps its petal open and becomes a star. I see that the poet is giving, I'm going to label this P, I'm going to underline this line, and I'm going to label this P for personification. I'm going to come back up here because I noticed that it gave it human-like qualities. It says, the poet said, the tulip feels. Now, can a tulip actually feel the heat? Does a tulip have feelings? No. So I know that's an example of personification. And the poet is sort of using that to make the nature come alive. So I'm going to say, what is the example of personification? The example, flip the question, of personification is the tulip. Tulip is a type of flower. Is the tulip / flower. I'm going to put in quotes, feeling the heat from the sun. All right. So I've identified at least one example of personification. As you keep reading, you're going to see that there are some other examples of personification in here. For example, I noticed that they said the birds were singing. I'm going to underline that and label that P. Birds can chirp, and we think they sound like songs, but the birds don't actually sing songs like humans do. So here's what I'm going to do. I just gave a lot of instruction. We walked through the poem. We marked it up. We did the gist statement. I got you started on the first couple questions. I'm going to set the timer for 5 minutes, and I would like you to work through the rest of these analysis questions all by yourself. Notice that some of these questions, I tell you the lines to look at, and for some of them I specify you need 3 other images, or look at these lines, what words does the poet repeat? How does the poet say the stones are feeling? Another example of personification. Alrighty. 5 minutes on the timer to work through numbers 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, all by yourself, working carefully and quickly. Begin. So again, right now, you're working through finishing these TDQs all by yourself, working through answering them. Okay, so if you are not finished with your TDQs over the poem, go ahead and pause your Edpuzzle video now. If you are fully finished with your TDQs, I'm going to go ahead and move us more into the independent practice part. I've been guiding you through. This has been guided practice. Now we're moving into the independent practice part of today's lesson. So as you get into independent practice, there are 6 questions that you're going to be asked about the poem. Each of these are all 10 ready practice questions. As you're working through the questions, I'm asking you to circle keywords in the question, cross out your wrong answers here, and give your explanation. When you give your explanation, if it is a question that you can cite evidence for, I'm expecting you to cite evidence and explain. If it is a question that there's already evidence, you need to tell me why that's the best piece of evidence. So for example, number 1 says, in line 7 of This World, what does the phrase bore into mean? Remember, I already modeled for you at the beginning how we think through a context clues questions. Take each of these, plug them back in, choose your answer, and explain. I'm going to be setting about 10 minutes on the timer for you to be working through each of your multiple choice questions. These explanations are so important. Please make sure that you are citing evidence and you're giving a detailed explanation. At the end for your exit ticket, you're going to be reflecting on which questions you missed and why. 10 minutes going on the timer. And begin. Each of these I will be counting for accuracy, so make sure that you're working through them carefully. Begin. Okay, so at this time, if you're not fully finished with your multiple choice, please go ahead and pause your Edpuzzle video now. Again, if you're not fully finished with your multiple choice, pause your Edpuzzle video now. Resume it once you answer each of your questions with your explanations. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to sort of reveal some of the correct answers so that you can check to see if you got them right or wrong. When we look over question 1, the correct answer was A. With plugging that in, that was the one that best met the meaning. Number 2, our correct answer for which word helps the reader understand the meaning of the word phrase. The correct answer was C. As you looked in the poem, that word well showed how he dug a hole into or bore into well. Number 3, if you were focusing on our type of figurative language, we saw that there was a lot of personifications. That one should have been easy. Number 4, 2 types of personification in the text. We talked about this, A, and this one you had to find as well. Make sure you explain. You will not get credit without your explanations. How does the poet reveal the speaker's attitude about life? For number 5, you should have looked down here at answer choice D that said by showing the benefits of slowing down and appreciating one's surroundings. We talked about appreciating the things around you. We saw evidence of that in the text. Which one of these best showed that? If we're not too hurried to hear it. This evidence that says we're not too hurried to hear it connects to answer choice D. So at this time, if you have not fully finished, you're going to go ahead and pause your video. If you have, you're going to go ahead and move straight into your exit ticket. Of course, if there's any part that you need to adjust, go ahead and pause now.